I've watched a lot of men of faith walk through my courtroom doors over the years, and most of them carry themselves with a kind of quiet dignity that I genuinely respect. But nothing, and I mean nothing in 38 years on this bench, prepared me for the morning Reverend Gerald Whitmore III walked in wearing a $3,000 suit and the expression of a man who had never once been told no. He came in expecting deference. He came in expecting that his collar, his congregation, and his family name would do what they'd apparently always done for him, make the inconvenient thing disappear. What happened instead became a story that people in this courthouse still talk about. I've been carrying it for 3 years now, and I think it's finally time to put it down somewhere. In my courtroom, a title means absolutely nothing. Reverend, Senator, Doctor, you walk in here, you are equal to the woman sitting across from you. That's not a threat. That's a promise. And Gerald Whitmore was about to learn it the hard way. Now let me back up a second. Gerald Whitmore III wasn't just any pastor. He was the third-generation leader of Whitmore Tabernacle of Grace, a megachurch operation out of Forsyth County that had been in his family since his grandfather broke ground in 1961. The current campus, I'm talking about the one that had been renovated twice since 2010, sat on 11 acres, had a sanctuary that seated 2,200 people on a Sunday morning, and a capital campaign that had raised, according to public filings, $4.6 million the previous fiscal year. The Whitmore name in that county wasn't just a name. It was something closer to a weather system. You just knew it was there, and you planned your life around it. Gerald pulled into the courthouse parking lot in a dove gray Range Rover, the autobiography trim, not the sport, and he parked it sideways across a line and a half. His assistant, a young man who carried a leather document case and wore the practiced expression of someone paid to anticipate problems, held the door open. Gerald stepped out, adjusted his lapels, and walked toward the entrance. He was wearing a charcoal gray Brioni suit, custom by the cut of it, with a pocket square the exact shade of cream. His shoes were Berluti. He had a Hublot Classic Fusion on his left wrist, the titanium ceramic model. I know what it is because my former clerk had one, and I asked him once how much it cost. He told me. I still think about it sometimes. Gerald arrived 22 minutes late. Not by accident. There's fashionably late, which is a social calculation. And there's disrespectfully late, which is a statement. Gerald was making a statement. He greeted his attorney, Mitchell Farrow of Farrow, Quint and Solberg, whose firm had done real estate work for the Whitmore Family Trust for 2 decades, with a shoulder clap and a laugh about something that had apparently happened at dinner the previous evening. He shook no one else's hand. He didn't look toward the plaintiff's table. He sat down, crossed one ankle over his knee, and checked his phone. I let the silence work for a moment. Strategic silence works wonders on people who think they're in control. Then let me tell you about the woman sitting at the plaintiff's table. Her name was Denise Okafor, 39 years old, originally from Savannah. She'd been in Forsyth County for 12 years, raised there by her own account after following her ex-husband north for work and then watching him leave for somewhere else entirely when their youngest was 14 months old. She was sitting at that table in her good blouse, a pale blue with small white buttons, the kind of blouse you save for the dentist and the bank and the courthouse. She'd ironed it that morning. You could see the crease down each sleeve, sharp as a ruler. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She had a small folder in front of her, manila, with her papers inside. Her hands were rough. I noticed that right away. The kind of rough that comes from years of cleaning products and cold water and not enough time to do anything about it. She had a small scar on her left index finger, pale against her skin, from what looked like a slip with something sharp. Her nails were clean and clipped short. No polish, no rings. She'd taken the ring off when her ex-husband left and never put anything back in its place. Denise had 3 kids, Amara, who was 11, Tobias, who was 8, and the baby, Chloe, who had just turned 3 and spent 2 afternoons a week at a subsidized daycare while Denise cleaned offices and homes and, for 4 years, the Whitmore Tabernacle of Grace. She'd been cleaning that church every Thursday morning and every Saturday evening for 4 years. She had a written agreement, hand-signed by Gerald Whitmore himself, dated March 14th, 3 years prior, that paid her $900 a month, paid on the 1st. She cleaned the sanctuary, the fellowship hall, the 4 administrative offices, 3 bathrooms, and the nursery. She brought her own supplies. She drove there in a 2011 Hyundai Sonata with a cracked rear bumper and a driver's side window that didn't go all the way down anymore. For 4 years, she showed up every Thursday, every Saturday, holidays included, unless Gerald specifically told her otherwise. She showed up even the Saturday after her mother's funeral in October. I'm not going to lie. When her attorney told me that detail, I had to set my pen down for a second. The thing she kept on the dashboard of that Sonata was a small laminated card with a Bible verse on it, Proverbs 31:17. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She'd put it there when she first started cleaning the church because she thought it was fitting. 4 years later, it was still there, sun-faded on the left edge, but still readable. I'll get back to that card. Because of all the small things that came in and out of my courtroom that morning, that card is the one that stayed with me. Gerald stopped paying her in February. Just stopped. The first check didn't come. She waited. She texted the church office. She called 3 times. She got the assistant, different from the courthouse assistant. This one was a woman named Tracy who managed the church calendar, and Tracy told her the accounting office was handling a transition. Denise waited 2 more weeks. No check. She called again. This time, Tracy told her that Reverend Whitmore would be reaching out to her directly to discuss the arrangement going forward. He never called. What Denise did next was exactly what you'd want someone to do. She kept showing up. She kept cleaning because she had a signed agreement and she'd been there 4 years, and she genuinely believed that the church would do right by her. She cleaned for 6 more weeks without being paid. 6 weeks. At $900 a month, she was owed by the time she finally stopped showing up and filed a small claims complaint, exactly $1,850. She would have been owed more, but she'd given Gerald 2 months of free labor before walking away. The complaint was for $1,850, plus the cost of cleaning supplies she could document, receipts she'd kept in a Ziploc bag in her glove box, organized by month. Total documented supplies, $412. She was asking for $2,262 and change. That's why Gerald Whitmore III was in my courtroom. $2,262, less than the cost of his pocket square and his parking ticket. Now, Gerald didn't take the stand immediately. We had preliminary matters. And it was during those preliminary matters that the first thing happened. His attorney, Mitchell Farrow, silver-haired, good suit, the kind of lawyer who charges $400 an hour and makes it feel like a favor, stood up to make a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the written agreement Denise had submitted was, in his words, not a binding contract under Georgia law, as it lacked adequate consideration and a defined termination clause. I let him finish. I looked at the document in my hand. I looked at Gerald's signature at the bottom, clear and confident, the kind of signature that expects to be recognized. I denied the motion. Farrow sat down. Gerald exhaled through his nose and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way you do when a flight is delayed and you've decided to be annoyed about it. Honestly, that was the first thing that put my back up. I've been doing this long enough that certain gestures carry weight. Then Gerald took the stand. His position, stated plainly, was that Denise's cleaning had become substandard in the final months of their arrangement, and that the church had the right to withhold payment pending a formal review that Gerald himself had been conducting. When I asked him what substandard meant, he said the nursery hadn't been up to code, and there had been dust issues in the administrative offices. When I asked him when he had communicated these concerns to Denise in writing, he said he hadn't gotten around to it. When I asked him whether he had communicated them verbally, he paused. I believe Tracy may have mentioned something to her. Denise shook her head slightly at the plaintiff's table. I saw it. Reverend Whitmore, I said, let me be direct. You have a woman in this room who cleaned your church every week for 4 years without a single documented complaint, and your position is that you withheld payment for undocumented quality issues that you chose not to communicate to her directly? He leaned back slightly. Well, I wouldn't characterize it that way. How would you characterize it? As a business matter that got complicated, I wrote something down. It didn't matter what. I've learned to write things down when what I actually want to do is say something I'd later regret. Then I asked him a question I'd been waiting to ask since I read his answer to the complaint. I asked him whether he was aware that during the 6 weeks Denise continued cleaning his church without pay, she had taken on a second job, evenings at a Waffle House on Highway 9, to cover the gap in her income. He said he was not aware. I asked if it would have changed anything if he had been. He looked at Farrow. Farrow gave him nothing. I don't see how that's relevant to the... It's relevant, I said, because I asked you. Silence. He said, I'm sure she has other resources. And there it was. That's the sentence that made the gallery shift. I heard a chair scrape in the back. Someone in the 3rd row, I'll get to her in a minute, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. His attorney touched his sleeve. Gerald crossed his arms. I let the room sit in that sentence for a moment. I'm sure she has other resources. 38 years on this bench, and those 5 words told me almost everything I needed to know about Gerald Whitmore III. Then I told him I wanted to see the video. Look, the video was always going to be the center of this thing. Denise's attorney, a young woman named Patricia Voss, first year in her own practice, no support staff, operating out of a converted bedroom in her apartment, had submitted it as Exhibit C. It was security footage from the church's own camera system, the kind mounted in the corner of the fellowship hall and facing the main entrance corridor. Gerald had apparently forgotten it existed. The footage was from a Thursday morning in late January, 6 days before Gerald stopped paying. It was time-stamped 7:14 a.m. The fellowship hall was dark except for the motion-sensitive overheads that Denise had triggered when she came in. You could see her moving through frame with a mop bucket, her coat still on because the church ran its heat on a timer, and it didn't kick on until 8. She was working efficiently, methodically. There was nothing substandard happening on that screen. What the footage also captured, and this is the part that Denise's attorney had flagged in her brief, was a moment at 7:31 a.m. when Gerald Whitmore himself walked through the fellowship hall. He hadn't listed this in any of his responses. He walked through, stopped briefly when he saw Denise, said something that the audio partially captured. The court's audio technician had cleaned it up. We played it twice. Gerald's voice clear enough. How long does this usually take you? Denise's voice off camera. About 4 hours on Thursdays, Reverend. Gerald, And then he walked on. No complaint about dust. No complaint about the nursery. No complaint about anything. He saw her working at 7:30 in the morning in a cold fellowship hall with her coat still on, and he said, and kept walking. The courtroom was quiet through the whole 32 seconds of that exchange. I looked at Gerald when the footage ended. He was looking at the table in front of him. His jaw was tight. There was no remorse in his posture, just the recalculation of a man adjusting his position. I've seen that look before, many times. I recognize it the way you recognize weather coming. Now I had a question for him that I wanted answered carefully. I asked him to walk me through the decision, exactly when, with whom, and on what basis, to stop paying Denise. He said it had been a board discussion. I asked him to name the board members who'd been present. He named 2. I asked him when that meeting took place. He said sometime in late January. I asked him if there were minutes. He said he didn't believe so. I asked him if he'd be willing to swear under oath that the decision to stop payment was made by a board and documented somewhere. And he said, I'd have to consult with my attorney on that. Mitchell Farrow, to his credit, looked like he was developing a headache. Then I asked Gerald one more question. I asked him how his wife, Eleanor, had felt about the church's cleaning arrangements during her time as First Lady of the congregation. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away 14 months prior from pancreatic cancer. She had been, by all accounts I'd read, a woman of considerable warmth and community investment. Gerald looked up at me. I said, I asked because I have something here I'd like to read from, if you don't mind. I picked up a document from my bench. I want to describe what it was, because the details here matter. It was a printed copy of the eulogy delivered at Eleanor Whitmore's funeral service, delivered by Gerald himself, which had been posted publicly on the Whitmore Tabernacle website and was therefore a matter of public record. Patricia Voss had found it. I don't know exactly when she'd found it, but she'd included it in her supplemental brief, and I'd read it the night before. I'll tell you what, in 38 years, I've never done exactly what I did next. But there are moments where the law and what's right converge so cleanly that you'd be a coward to look away. I read from the eulogy. Gerald's own words, written and spoken at his wife's funeral. This is what he'd written. Eleanor understood something that the rest of us are still learning. She understood that the people who keep a community running are not the ones at the podium. They are the ones in the parking lot before dawn, the ones in the kitchen after everyone's gone home, the ones whose names you don't know but whose work you live inside every single day. She never walked past someone working without stopping to say thank you. She said it was the most important thing she knew how to do. I read it slowly. I set my glasses down on the bench when I finished. The courtroom was very quiet. Gerald's hands, which had been resting flat on the table, were now clasped in front of him. His knuckles had gone pale. I looked at him for a moment. I didn't say anything. Then from the gallery, 3 rows back on the left side, a woman stood up. She was older, maybe 70, in a black cardigan and reading glasses hung around her neck on a beaded chain. This was Loretta Sims, Eleanor Whitmore's mother. She'd been sitting there the entire time, and I hadn't introduced her because she wasn't a party to the proceedings. But she stood up and she looked at her son-in-law across that courtroom, and she said in a voice that carried without any effort at all, "Gerald," just his name. Nothing else. He turned to look at her. And whatever passed between them in that second, I was not going to intrude on it. His attorney said quietly, "Reverend Whitmore, I'd advise." Gerald held up one hand. Farrow stopped. Gerald turned back to face the bench. He unclenched his hands. And he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to be on the record, "I should have paid her." That was it. 4 words. I let them land. Then I got to work. Here is what I sentenced Gerald Whitmore III to that morning. He was found liable for breach of written contract, which he had by that point effectively conceded. The judgment was for the full amount claimed, $2,262.48 in unpaid wages and documented supply costs, plus attorney's fees for Patricia Voss, which I set at $940 because her work on this case was thorough and she'd done it for a client who couldn't afford much. Total, $3,202.48. Payable within 30 days. That's the legal part. But I want to tell you about the rest of it because that's not where this story ends. I also issued something that I don't do in every small claims case, but that I have the discretion to issue when I believe a pattern of conduct warrants it. A formal written finding that the defendant had engaged in willful non-payment of wages owed under a signed agreement, with full knowledge of the plaintiff's economic circumstances. That finding goes into the public record. It is searchable. Any nonprofit, foundation, grant-making body, or government entity doing due diligence on the Whitmore Tabernacle of Grace would find it. I further ordered Gerald Whitmore to provide, within 60 days, a signed letter of apology to Denise Okafor, reviewed by this court for authenticity and specificity, meaning it could not be a form letter, could not use passive voice to avoid accountability, and had to acknowledge, by name, what he had done and why it was wrong. Then I ordered him to complete 40 hours of community service at the Forsyth County Family Resource Center, which helps single parents in economic crisis with job training, childcare navigation, and emergency financial assistance. The same center that Denise Okafor had contacted 6 weeks into her unpaid period, looking for help covering a gas bill. I want to be clear about something. When I read from that eulogy, I wasn't doing it to humiliate him. I wasn't performing for the room. I did it because there is sometimes a gap between what a person says they believe and how they actually move through the world. And when that gap has material consequences for someone else, it belongs on the record. It belongs in the light. Gerald's father, Carl Whitmore, who had been sitting in the first row of the gallery in a dark suit and hadn't said a word during the entire proceeding, stood up when I finished reading my order. I thought for a moment he was going to say something about the family's reputation, or reference the church's status, or invoke something I'd have to strike from the record. Instead, he walked to the gallery railing, looked at his son and said, "I'll be outside," and left. Farrow started to gather his papers. Gerald sat still for a long moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without looking at Denise. Denise sat for a moment after he left. She looked down at her manila folder. She closed it. She looked over at Patricia Voss, who was stuffing papers into a canvas tote bag with a broken strap held together by a binder clip. They looked at each other. Denise said something I couldn't hear. Patricia laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised. Then Denise stood up and walked out into the hallway. I was told later, by my clerk, who had followed up out of her own curiosity, that Denise sat in her car in the parking lot for about 20 minutes before she drove away. That she called her mother first. That she cried. And not for any reason you'd expect, but because she said she hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd been holding. Now, about a year later, Gerald completed his community service at the Family Resource Center. He didn't send a representative. He showed up himself in clothes that were notably less expensive than what he'd worn to court, and he did the 40 hours over about 8 weeks. I heard from someone who volunteers there that he was quiet at first, kept to himself, did what he was told. Sometime around week 5, he started staying a little longer than required. Nobody made a big thing about it. The apology letter came in at day 58, 2 days before the deadline. It was 4 paragraphs. My clerk read it first and flagged it as meeting the standard I'd set. I read it myself. I'll tell you this, it was specific. It named what he'd done. It named her by name and her children by name, all three of them, including Chloe, who just turned 3 when all of this happened. There was a line in the third paragraph about Eleanor. I won't repeat it here because some things aren't mine to share, but I read it twice. The $3,202.48 was paid on day 29, 1 day early, wire transfer. Denise, as far as I know, has not returned to cleaning the Whitmore Tabernacle. She did, however, use some of what she recovered, combined with a small grant from the Family Resource Center that she applied for after her case, to get a business license and some basic equipment. She now has 4 residential cleaning clients and 2 small commercial contracts. She hired 1 part-time employee last spring, a woman from her daughter Amara's school who needed the work. Patricia Voss, the attorney, took 2 more cases from the Family Resource Center in the 12 months following. Pro bono. She told me, through a mutual acquaintance, that this case was the reason why. The laminated card is still on Denise's dashboard. She told this to a local reporter who did a small piece on the case 8 months after the verdict, the kind of piece that runs on page 7 and doesn't go viral, but gets read by the right people. She said she thought about taking it down after everything that happened, because the verse had come from a church, and the church had complicated feelings for her now. But she said she thought about it and decided that the words were still true, regardless of who'd handed them to her. She kept the card. Fairness and compassion are not opposites. A spine without a heart is just a stick. The law is meant to serve people, all of them, not just the ones with good suits and leather document cases and names that open doors. Eleanor Whitmore understood that. She wrote it into her life in the spaces between the visible things, the spaces that someone like Denise Okafor moved through every Thursday morning at 7 a.m., with a mop bucket and her coat still on. The moment the law forgets that, it stops being just. It becomes something else, a tool, a prop, a performance. And no collar, no matter how white, no matter how starched, is a substitute for a conscience. That's what I've learned in 38 years. And some mornings, driving to this courthouse, I still think about a cold fellowship hall and a woman who kept showing up anyway.